how I would go about purchasing my first investment property in 2023. And we're going to break it down into 5 very simple but very actionable steps to take you from not having a deposit all the way through to actually executing, signing a contract, and buying the first investment property, and then obviously building out your investment property portfolio. Now, you're probably wondering, who is this bloke and why should I listen to him? My name's Jack Henderson. I'm the founder of Henderson Advocacy, which is one of Australia's fastest growing buyer's agents, and I've personally built a $26+ million portfolio, all by the age of 26 years old. So you could say I know a thing or two about building portfolios very quickly. The first step in building a property portfolio is being able to have the capacity to build a property portfolio. And there's a few different variables that come in to building a portfolio. Naturally, you need to have a job so you can earn an income to be able to go to the bank to borrow money, because without borrowing money, it's very hard to buy property, and we need the banks on our side. So the first thing you're going to need, income. Now, your income is going to then directly correlate to how much money you can borrow from the bank, which is then going to dictate the budget in which you're going to have to spend on the property. Now, based on what your income is, which is based on what your budget is going to be, is then based on how much money you're going to need to save for a deposit. Now, depending on what state you're in inside of Australia, there are different first home buyer incentives in each state. I'm not going to break them down one by one. You can do some Googling and understand what the first home buyer incentives are for your state. But regardless of what state you are in, usually I would say to take advantage of the first home buyer incentives, because as soon as you buy your first property, you are no longer entitled to first home buyer incentives. The first step in being able to get ready to buy your portfolio is to understand how much money you can borrow based on your current income. So we're essentially reverse engineering what we're going to spend on a property, which is going to be obviously dictated by our income, which is then going to give us an understanding of how much money we're going to need to save for a deposit. Because a lot of people can obviously save money, but very few people know how much money they need to buy a property, and they don't know how to build out a savings plan. And that's our first step, is building out a savings plan for a deposit for our first property. Are you enjoying the video? You know the drill. Like, subscribe, and comment. Here at Henderson, we like to upload vlogs, tutorials, educational content, and it all goes on YouTube. Any advice you see or hear on these videos is just for entertainment purposes only. Read any applicable PDS available. We are not taking into consideration any of your personal circumstances. Make sure you go and seek independent financial advice, and don't take what I say as gospel, folks, because it may not be right for you. So if we know that based on our income, and let's hypothetically say we're a first home buyer earning $80,000 a year, the bank will roughly lend us 6 to 7 times our income. So if you're on 80 grand a year, there's a good chance the bank's going to lend you around about $500,000 to $600,000. Now, if the bank's willing to lend us $600,000, and let's hypothetically say we live inside of New South Wales, and currently inside of New South Wales, there is a thing called the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme, which is a scheme in which you can buy your first property with a 5% deposit, paying no lender's mortgage insurance and paying no stamp duty. So essentially what that means is you need 5% of the property value to buy a property. So if we know that the bank has said based on your income, you can borrow or spend $600,000. And we know that in New South Wales, we need 5% of that $600,000 to be able to buy our first property. So 5% of 600 grand is $30,000. So we know that before we can even go to the bank and get pre-approved to be able to get out there and do all the exciting stuff, which is buying a property, we need to have a minimum of $30,000 saved. So let's say that we've got 52 weeks, and if you divide 30,000 by 50, we get $600. So if we can save $600 per week, in 50 weeks, we're gonna be at our $30,000 deposit target. Now, depending on how much you save, obviously that is going to depend on the runway you need to give yourself. Not everyone's going to be able to save $600 per week, especially not if you live out of home, you're out there, you know, living a normal lifestyle, you have expenses, right? You may be only able to save $100 a week. So if you go, well, I need 30 grand and I can only save $100 a week, it's gonna take me 6 years to be able to save a deposit. So maybe you have to look down other avenues, maybe do a joint venture with a partner, maybe, you know, be able to earn some more income on the side. Whatever your situation is, the first step is understanding how much money you need for a deposit, how long of a time frame you want to be able to save for that deposit, breaking it down, and then building out a savings plan. Step number 2 in being able to buy your first investment property within 12 months is to, once we have our deposit, then go to a mortgage broker or go to a bank to be able to get in a position where we are finance ready. Now, what finance ready means is we need to go to the bank, give them all of our documents that they need, our pay slips, our income and expenses, all of our ID documents and everything that the bank requires to be able to give you a thing called a pre-approval. Now, what a pre-approval means is it's an offer to lend. So the bank is saying to you, based on your current circumstance, based on the cash deposit that you have, based on your income and expenses, we will lend you X amount of dollars, and usually a pre-approval lasts for 3 to 6 months, meaning that that offer to lend is valid for 3 to 6 months. So you want to go and speak, I would say, with a mortgage broker, because mortgage brokers have lots of lenders on their panel, of which they can go and choose the best one for you. Because if you just walk into your local bank, they can be great, but that bank may not be the right lender for you, and they're only going to be able to give you their products. So I would say once you've got the $30,000 that we spoke about as the 5% deposit for a $600,000 property, you want to go to a mortgage broker, and usually you'd go to the mortgage broker which would have assessed you at step number 1 when we have an understanding of how much we can borrow on our income. So you go back to that mortgage broker, you're going to say, I've got my deposit now, here's all of my income and expenses and statements and all the rest of it. You're going to then need to get a pre-approval from that lender. And something that people often forget is they don't understand the terms and conditions of their pre-approval. Now, every bank is different, but what you want to understand is, are there any postcode restrictions? Meaning, does that bank not like certain postcodes, which they're going to not be as favorable in the bank's eyes? Because sometimes they will only lend you 70% of a property's value if it's in a high density area, for example. So you want to understand what the conditions are of the pre-approval, and make sure that when you move to step 3, which is what we're going to talk about next, which is getting out there into the marketplace and searching, you want to make sure that you're actually searching in the right location and you're going out there and looking to buy an asset that appeals to the bank. Because if you can tick all of the bank's boxes as to what they look for when they're assessing a property, you're going to be able to buy an asset of which is likely to be a very good asset, because the banks like good assets naturally. So speak to a broker, get your pre-approval underway. This can take, 4 to 6 weeks, depending on how slow or fast the bank is. Get an understanding of what the bank likes from an asset selection standpoint. And then once you get that pre-approval, you are now in a position to be able to step out there into the property market and have finance approval, so you're nearly ready to buy. And now step number 3, once you've got your finance pre-approved and you are ready to get out there in the marketplace to buy your property, is the actual property search, which is where most people actually get stuck. There's a lot of people who can save a deposit. There's a lot of people who can speak with a broker and get pre-approved. But when it actually starts to become real and you're out there in the wild, wild property market, speaking with real estate agents, going to open for inspections, trying to work out what everything means and which properties are good, which properties are not bad, that's when people get stuck. So the searching component is obviously a very, very important component. And before you start searching, you want to try and get clear on where you are searching and what you are searching for, which obviously requires a lot of research and prior work through the internet. So when we get out there in the marketplace, the more clear and definitive we are on what we're looking for, the easier it makes it for us to be decisive in our actions when we're searching for property. So when I'm searching for property, I like to understand the suburbs in which I'm going to be searching in and making sure that those suburbs are actually realistic for my budget. I want to be knowing the kind of properties I'm buying in those suburbs. So naturally, we want to be buying properties that appeal to the majority of the buyers in the marketplace. So if we're in a suburb where all of the buyers in that suburb, or almost all of the buyers in that suburb live in houses, I probably wouldn't go buy an apartment there, and vice versa. So making sure that we understand the suburb that we're in, the location that we're in, the kind of property we're buying inside of that suburb, and then what our money is actually going to buy us with those two things. So if we know that we go to the sold section, for example, of realestateanddomain.com, we put in our suburbs, we put in recently sold, we then do, up to, let's say our budget $600,000. It'll then show us all of the properties that have sold up to $600,000 in that area. And now we want to get an understanding of the similarities of those properties. How big are they? Meaning how many square meters are their blocks, or how many internal square meters is the apartment, for example. The style of them, what style of property, are we getting an established property, or are we getting a brand new property? So getting an understanding of how many properties are selling, what they're actually selling for, then helps us when we get out there in the marketplace and start searching to not waste time on properties that are likely to be under or over our budget. And in any market around Australia, a lot of buyers get out there and they waste time because, let's face it, real estate agents are not always the most transparent people, right? They're working for the vendor, not the buyer. Now we need to remember that when we go out there and start looking at open for inspections, real estate agents are being paid by the vendor to get the vendor the best result. So naturally, they could underguide properties, for example, which means you're going to go in there and think, oh, wow, it says 550 to 600,000 on the internet. But the reality is they're just saying that because they want to get lots of people interested in the property, and then it sells for 800,000. So usually if you go out there and it seems too good to be true, so you've looked at your sold section and then 50 properties that have sold in the last 6 months within that price bracket have been 2-bedroom apartments of 80 square meters, for example, or a house on 500 square meters of land that's unrenovated. And this property comes up and it's renovated and it's beautiful and it's bigger, it's in a better pocket of the suburb. There's a good chance that they are misleading you and you go down the garden path, because a lot of people get caught up in the beautiful ads and the copy and the agent saying, yeah, you've got a really good chance of being able to secure this, when the reality is they're doing that to be able to generate interest. So the clearer we can be on what our money buys us and the more realistic we can be, the faster we're going to be able to get into the marketplace, see as many properties as we need to see, and then actually move to the next step, which is then doing the due diligence and getting to the negotiation point of an asset. Depending on where you are in your journey, obviously you're buying your first property, but if you're looking at this property as being your owner-occupier property that you're going to live in for the next 20 years, you're going to be looking at it through a different lens, right? Because it's much more personal. It's going to be your home. If you're buying the first property as an investment property, you can be more objective with the decision. It's just an investment. It needs to be based on our numbers. So depending on where you're at and what you're looking to achieve, obviously, there's going to be a different time frame. But the more groundwork we can do, the more understanding we can have of what our money buys us in each suburb, the kind of properties, how often they come up, then the easier it's going to be for us to go through that searching process, deal with the agents, and then move into that next step, which we're going to talk about now, which is the due diligence and the negotiation when we find the right property. So step 4, we're now up to the pointy end and the exciting part, which is where a lot of buyers can get nervous and come unstuck or make mistakes, which is obviously the due diligence and the negotiating of the asset that we're trying to buy, or the home or the property we are trying to buy. So obviously, before we can get into the negotiation and start talking dollars and cents, we firstly need to do the due diligence on the property, which is essentially making sure that we understand all the ins and outs of the property, if it has any faults, if there are things that we are unaware of right now that we can potentially use as leverage in the negotiation. And every property that we look at is going to be different when it comes to due diligence, right? If you're looking at a house, the due diligence you do on that house is probably going to be slightly different to if you're looking at an apartment, and it's going to differ from state to state. Number one thing we want to understand when we're doing our due diligence is that there is no structural issues with the property, because usually structural issues are going to be the most expensive thing if there are issues with the property. So getting a builder or a pest and building inspector obviously to inspect the property. If we're looking at an apartment, getting your strata inspector to look at the strata minutes and reports of that asset. And usually as we're doing these two things, we're also then getting our contracts reviewed to make sure that inside of the contract we're aware of all the terms, and if we need to make any amendments to those terms, we can do so before we start negotiating. When we place offers, and this is going to vary again state to state, but when we place offers for properties, we often want to put an offer on a contract, not in an email, not via text, on a contract, because an agent can often take a contract to their vendor because it holds more weight. And when they're sitting in front of their vendor to say, hey, we've got an offer, it's on a contract, all you need to do is sign and it's done, that is a very, very powerful thing. Because what we're trying to do in this due diligence phase is uncover any little bits of gold that we can then use as leverage in our negotiation, or any little bits of gold we can find to then obviously help us understand, well, what we're willing to pay for the property based on the potential for us to have to spend a little bit more money once we actually own the property. But you don't want to overdo the due diligence and obviously get caught up in the analysis paralysis. But what you do want to do is do enough due diligence so both yourself and the people around you that are helping you, like your builder, like your conveyancer or solicitor, like anyone else you've got in that due diligence process, can then obviously feel comfortable to say, yes, we're aware of everything that is right and is wrong with the property. We understand the things that we can use as leverage in the negotiation. And once we're in that position and we've got all of our amendments and we're ready to rock, then we can move into the negotiation piece. Where a lot of people go wrong is that before they do their due diligence, they start talking dollars and cents with the agent. Now, talking dollars and cents and then having an agreement on price and then doing your due diligence and finding out things that you now can use as leverage, it's hard to then come back and negotiate down. So when we're buying property, we always do our due diligence first, get an understanding of what we can use, get an understanding of what the property is actually worth based on our comparable sales and the research and data that we have available to us. That then helps us form our negotiation. And when we move into the negotiation piece, depending on what state you're in, again, depending on how the property is marketed, it could be an auction campaign, it could be a private treaty, it could be an expressions of interest, it could be just listed at a certain price. Obviously, depending on how it's marketed is going to vary slightly on the negotiation. Usually what we want to do when we're in a negotiation is not start at obviously what we're willing to pay for the property. We usually want to start below that and obviously work our way up to that point. And there's a few things you want to make sure that you ask and you get clear on before you start negotiating. Now, one of those things is the vendor actually in the headspace to sell the property? If we gave them an offer that is a fair offer and where the property is likely to sell at, are they actually ready to accept? Because some people are not. If you go for the first open for inspection, for example, and then you do your due diligence and put an offer forward within the first week, sometimes the vendors are not ready to sell, which means your offer's now sitting on the table and you've opened your hands, and potentially the agent can use that offer as leverage to then obviously get more out of other buyers. Then need to understand what the time frame is going to be from if we get an offer accepted to when the property is actually going to exchange. Because when you get an offer accepted, in that time frame between offer acceptance and exchange, that is where you can get gazumped, meaning you've got an offer accepted, you get all excited, you're doing all the paperwork, and another buyer comes in and makes an offer higher than yours and they buy the property from underneath you. So obviously we want to make sure that when we make the offer and to when the property exchanges is as small a time frame as possible. Sometimes it's literally less than an hour. A lot of the time it's a few hours. Once you've got an understanding of those two things and obviously make sure that they align, you then start moving into the dollars and cents of the negotiation. And again, this is going to depend on whether the agent has priced the property correctly, whether it's overpriced, whether it's underpriced, but then it's about placing an offer. So put an offer on a contract. Often we're sending it to the agent and we're CCing in their solicitor. And when we make the offer, we naturally want to get an understanding of how long the vendor is going to need to think about and give us an answer on the offer. And obviously not put a definitive time frame and try and back the agent up against the wall, but you want to work collaboratively with the agent to say, hey, if I make an offer, how long is the vendor going to need to be able to consider the offer, and when will you be able to get back to us? And that obviously manages your own expectations. And then obviously the negotiation is going to unfold, and it's obviously very important that you have an understanding of what the property is actually worth to you, what your limit is and what you are willing not to go over, and obviously stick to that, because budget is obviously very important, but you need to make sure it's also realistic. And now we're up to step 5, which is the final step. We've obviously negotiated the property, we've got offer and acceptance, the contracts have exchanged, and now we're moving into our settlement period, which can vary. It's often somewhere around that 6-week period. And during that settlement period, this is obviously when we're getting our unconditional finance. We're getting loan documents sent across to us so we can sign those loan documents. We're giving them back to the broker. Our conveyancer or solicitor is liaising with the vendors, conveyancer or solicitor, to set up the settlement dates. And obviously, as we move through that 6-week period, we're obviously getting to the date where, you know, the bank obviously transfers the money into the settlement account. You put your deposit into the settlement account, and obviously settlement occurs and you get the keys to the property. Now, there's a few things that you can do during this time, like getting early access to the property, which is often negotiated in that due diligence phase. For example, if you want to get, you know, a builder in there, for example, to measure up a new kitchen or, you know, new bathroom, so you can start the process of, you know, ordering bits and pieces and starting to engage trade. So when you settle, you've obviously made progress there. Often people want to measure up the furniture, for example. So you can negotiate those things, and you are entitled to one inspection regardless of if it's negotiated or not, which is called the pre-settlement inspection, which usually takes place 1 to 2 days before you settle on the property. You'll walk through the property with the real estate agent, which is obviously pre-arranged, to make sure that the property was in the same condition as when you purchased it. And if it's not, you can actually negotiate certain things off the price because you didn't purchase the property in that condition. When settlement occurs, you'll obviously get the keys. You're now a property owner. From there, the reality is once you've got your foot in the door, you're now a property owner. You want to make sure that your finance is structured correctly, you know, taking advantage of things like offset accounts where you can, being strategic with your money, which we'll create another video on later so we can give you an understanding of how to maximize your dollar. But when you've purchased your first property, that is the hardest asset that you will ever buy, because it's something you had to save cold hard cash for and trade your time for money. Now you've got a property in the market, and that property is growing in value. It's essentially a forced savings account. Let's say you put 30 grand into the $600,000 property. That $600,000 property grows at the national average, which is about 6.5% per year. So every year that property is growing at 35, 40 grand a year. So, you know, you're making significant equity over a period of time. And then once you get enough equity in that property, which means the gap between your mortgage and the value of that property, then you can refinance that equity, which means go back to the bank and withdraw it if you have the serviceability, which again, we'll talk through in another video, and then go and buy subsequent assets. So the reality is, after you've bought your first property, if you never wanted to save another dollar to put into another property again, you wouldn't need to, because the property does the savings for you. Now, as you can see, this is a 25-minute odd video, and we've just taken you from not having any money to buying your first property in 25 minutes, broken it down in very simple steps, from building out a savings plan over the time frame and when you want to have your money, by reverse engineering what you can actually spend, which then gives you how much you need to save, getting pre-approved and finance ready so you're not out there in the marketplace not ready to buy, then understanding what you can afford, the locations you're looking in, and how to go about making that the most efficient process. We've gone through the due diligence and negotiation of a certain asset, and now we're obviously at the settlement, the keys, and then moving on to growing our portfolio, which we will run through in further videos. So I hope that helped. And there you go, folks. Now you know. Well, if you like this one, let me tell you, I've got a little puppy up here that you'll probably like, and a little one on the right-hand side that you'll like too. So click them bad boys and get watching.